August 2012, Walton, Liverpool. A 53-year-old man, Kevin Bennett, lies in a pool of his own blood outside a supermarket where he's been sleeping.
This attack was extremely brutal. These boys showed no mercy.
Badly battered and kicked into unconsciousness, he will later die from complications associated with his injuries.
They kicked him to death, they jumped on him, they stamped him. Kevin Bennett didn't stand a chance.
But the savage and fatal beating is not meted out as some form of punishment by hardened criminals.
Neighbours told us that they were a plague on the community.
The perpetrators are teenage boys. The motive? They were just out to cause trouble.
They didn't just commit the act, they thought about it, they prepared for it, and sadly they executed it.
The badly injured body of Kevin Bennett was discovered. He'd been badly beaten and kicked around the body and head. He'd suffered a fractured eye socket, a collapsed lung, and a broken rib cage, and died in hospital 6 days later. Emergency services who attended the scene presumed the attack was the work of some person or persons who had some sort of argument to settle with the victim. But Kevin Bennett was a vulnerable, homeless alcoholic who, it would transpire, had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Kevin Bennett was an alcoholic and was leading a pretty chaotic existence, but relatives said that his descent into alcoholism happened as a result of the death of his father. He was very close to his father, Chuck, as he was known. Both of them worked on in the same factory, the same peanut factory in Liverpool for years and years, and his death hit him particularly hard. His drinking led to the breakdown of his marriage, caused him basically to start living rough. He occasionally slept at his mother's house. He had a bed there, but didn't like to disturb her. Friends described him as a likeable drunk, a harmless drunk who would have banter with them in the pub, but would never be nasty or cause any trouble.
The unfortunate man had been sleeping rough around Walton for some time, and while the area had had its difficulties, this level of wanton and unprovoked violence was extremely rare.
Walton's an old-fashioned working-class district of Liverpool. It's a tough area to grow up in. There's some difficult antisocial behaviour, there's some petty crime, but there's also, I would say, a sense of togetherness and a sense of community that still exists there.
In Walton and with other areas of North Liverpool, drug dealing is a big issue. Antisocial behaviour, kids on streets causing terror in the communities. I think recently in Liverpool there's been a big problem with scrambler bikes on the streets causing terror for the communities, and there's a real will amongst the communities in Walton and Liverpool to really stop these gangs and restore some law and order.
But law and order was something which meant nothing to the Doran family. Linda Doran had lived in Walton most of her life. Her life had been steadily spiralling out of control for years. She had had significant problems controlling her children over the years, and by 2012, the problem just seemed to be getting worse.
She had 4 sons and a daughter. She couldn't control her kids, but she didn't seem to make much of an effort to do so. She was convicted by the courts of failing to ensure her children went to school. She said it wasn't her fault that they would jump out of a taxi before it got to the school gates. Linda had a complete disregard for the whereabouts of her sons.
Not only was there problems in the household and problems with parenting and probably very little guidance in terms of how to be a good parent. Linda was probably never offered any type of training in relation to how to bring up her children. But then outside of the family home, right outside the door, there's all this horrendous stuff going on as well. So not only are these children picking up terrible messages at home, where a parent just doesn't know how to be a parent, once they leave their front door, they're faced with these horrendous crimes and horrendous things that they're seeing as well. Not only is this a bad home environment, but it's an incredibly challenging environment outside the front door to be growing up in as well.
Connor and Brandon and the Doran family generally were well known across Walton. They were notorious. The older brother was jailed a year before for the unprovoked murder of a man in a chip shop.
To describe the two younger Doran brothers as wild would be something of an understatement.
Connor and Brandon were known for years in the community in Walton. They would cross people's gardens. They would just cause chaos. They kept strange hours. They would be up all night. Barely a day went past when a neighbour didn't knock on the door of Linda Doran's house and say, where are your kids? They're causing chaos, so you need to get them inside.
They would roam the estate that they were from, the neighbourhood, go in the neighbours' gardens, robbing kids, threatening neighbours, a whole plethora of antisocial behaviour. Connor and Brandon Doran had a very, shall we say, neglected upbringing. Neither of them knew their father well at all. There was a large family of children. There was numerous fathers of these children. The children had no control, no discipline.
They were law unto themselves.
It was clear that Connor and Brandon were out of control, with far more freedom and significantly less supervision than most children of their age. Their situation was exacerbated by the behaviour of their older brothers.
The two older Doran brothers were already in gangs, already got minor criminal convictions as well, were well known to the police, they had ASBOs. Jordan was known in the local area for breaking into houses. Incredibly, his nickname was Bumhole because he was so small he could fit in through windows. He also stood trial for killing a man whose house was set alight by burglars, but Jordan was actually cleared of his manslaughter following a trial. So the two younger ones just grew up knowing nothing else. They were allowed to stay out late at night. They played on their Xbox at all hours of the day, taking drugs, drinking from a young age, really just no parental responsibility whatsoever. Jordan Doran, the Doran Brothers' middle brother, was one of the youngest children in Merseyside to be given an ASBO when they were first introduced. He was just 14 when he was banned from hanging around with his unruly friends. A gang of them made the lives of neighbours and people in the community where they lived an absolute misery. He would threaten to break their windows with a hockey stick. He launched eggs at buses, generally swearing at them in the street, swearing at police officers. Shopkeepers in Anfield, where they lived at the time, were so intimidated by Jordan that they actually reported a 50% drop in their business when he was around.
There was also a sense that the Doran family had developed an innate dislike of the police from an early age. They believed the police were the enemy, a group to be disliked and disobeyed rather than respected.
None of the Doran brothers had any respect for authority. Other family members claim that this is because they believed the police had botched an investigation into the death of their uncle. Darren Doran was found dead in his flat of a heroin overdose. A man was due to stand trial for injecting him with heroin, but the case never got to fruition. The prosecution dropped it at the start of the trial and no one was ever brought to justice. Brandon was just a few months old when his uncle Darren died, and so none of the brothers held any respect for police because they thought this was a great injustice that his death hadn't been properly investigated.
I don't think there's any doubt that in the Doran family, genetics plays a big part. When we talk about genetics and crime, we refer to what's known as personality disorder and particularly psychopathy. It's highly likely that one or more members of the family do suffer from psychopathy, if we can put it like that, and if they don't, they ape or mimic the others in the family.
The Dorans' utter disrespect and dislike for the police and the difficulties which appeared endemic in the family as a whole meant their situation was a disaster waiting to happen. But what they did on an August night in 2012 would shock even the most hardened commentator.
They kicked him to death, they jumped on him, they stamped him. Kevin Bennett didn't stand a chance.
53-year-old Kevin Bennett, a vulnerable, homeless man, was kicked and punched senseless in the early hours of August the 17th, 2012, as he slept in the doorway of a premises in Walton, Liverpool. He later died of his injuries. Earlier that evening, teenagers Brandon and Connor Doran had been roaming the estate where they lived with their mother, Linda, and her other sons, Ryan and Jordan, and her daughter, Casey. The Dorans were growing up in a world of deprivation. It was already clear that Linda's family were going off the rails. The eldest Doran, Ryan, was facing charges of murder after he attacked a stranger with a bottle in a chip shop. Accompanying the two younger Doran boys on the night of the 17th of August was Simon Evans, a neighbour, like Brandon, aged just 14.
He didn't come from a family where petty criminality was the norm. His mother was an alcoholic and his father died of skin cancer when he was only 11, which, according to other relatives, was particularly difficult for him to deal with.
Simon was a model pupil. He was top of his class and got good marks. For a 14-year-old boy in North Liverpool, knowing the Doran Brothers would have given you street cred, you would have been cool. It was better to be seen with the likes of the Doran Brothers than to be a top achiever.
The teenagers had come across Kevin Bennett before.
Kevin Bennett was actually beaten up previously, and Connor was there and he waited with him until the ambulance came.
And it begs the question that why, just weeks later, was Connor Doran involved in his own attack on Kevin Bennett?
Possibly. It may have been that Kevin Bennett was attacked prior to his murder by Connor Doran as perhaps a dry run, perhaps a first step in what would ultimately become his murder. Only the next time there would be others instigated and brought into it.
But on the night of the 17th of August, the brothers and Simon Evans would show no such mercy. Midnight on the 17th of August, the small gang was still out and about.
Connor, his younger brother Brandon and Simon Evans were out late at night, roaming the streets. They'd gone out to buy crisps and energy drinks, and on the way to Iceland went via a petrol station.
They were seen taking plastic gloves from near the fuel pumps. Having left the petrol station, they made their way to the back of the supermarket where Kevin Bennett was. They knew he'd be there.
Kevin Bennett had been in the pub from 11 a.m. on the 16th of August and had consumed between 10 and 12 pints of lager. He left just after midnight with a white carrier bag full of more cans of lager and settled down for the night behind the Iceland store on County Road.
They arrived at the supermarket, Connor Doran and Simon Evans, and saw Kevin Bennett fast asleep. Connor Doran goaded Simon and said, "I dare you to kick him." After that, Connor took charge and started stamping on Kevin Bennett. Both the boys did. They jumped on him, they stamped him.
And one member of the group taunted the other and said, "I bet you don't have it in you to do him in." So there was a lot of peer pressure on people within that small group to cause harm to other people. They were teased and taunted for not being manly enough to cause harm to another individual.
The attack was extremely vicious. The boys continued to rain blows and kicks onto the defenceless man.
This attack was extremely brutal. These boys showed no mercy towards Kevin Bennett. Here you have a homeless 53-year-old middle-aged man, heavily under the influence of alcohol, sleeping it off on the street. He didn't do these boys any harm, and yet they showed him no mercy whatsoever and were particularly cruel. They took turns to kick him. They took turns to jump on his chest. The injuries were appalling.
The cowardly attack continued for a number of minutes. Connor, the ringleader, goading his younger accomplices to kick Kevin Bennett ever harder.
We know that these boys abused alcohol and cannabis regularly. The fact that they would have taken it on the night will have acted as a trigger. There seems to be some evidence that the boys, even at this early age, could have been suffering from what is known as cannabis psychosis. That, combined with alcohol, can provide a deadly cocktail. Cannabis psychosis is psychosis by any other name. In other words, it is a mind that is utterly deranged, but this time it is deranged due to the inhalation or abuse of cannabis. So it replicates psychosis in all the ways we might understand it. However, is brought about not by genetic or societal influences, but by cannabis itself. The fact that there were 3 people involved in this crime certainly does smack of a pack mentality. And we do know that it is easier for men, regardless of their psychological makeup, to commit horrendous crimes when they're in the company of other. What it becomes is a diluted responsibility. That person doesn't have to take full blame. The blame can be shared, or indeed, as in this case, not at all.
I wonder if they were receiving a lot of praise in their environment for being violent towards individuals, that it was cool and brave and manly to hurt people. So there's this kind of gang pack mentality with them. They're doing it as a group. They're receiving validation somewhere from it, I think within that group, but probably amongst their peers outside of that group, boasting about it. And there's certainly some evidence that they said, I booted that man, and they're proud of that behaviour. So they're getting reinforced both outside of that group, but within the group as well for carrying out that behaviour.
It was the middle of the night. The frenzied attack was over. The gang fled the scene. They had done what they'd come to do.
They may have just intended to give him a hiding, but unfortunately what happens when they're in that situation, it goes too far. They go beyond. The whole frenzied side of that is taken over by that part of their brain that just, it's our most primitive.
CCTV footage actually showed the boys looking down at their shoes, and this later emerged that they were actually checking their clothes for blood, and the blood of Kevin Bennett was on their shoes.
Kevin Bennett was discovered by Iceland staff arriving for work at 7 a.m. the next day.
Kevin Bennett's body was discovered when staff at the supermarket arrived for work and police were called. They found blood smeared on the air conditioning unit. Kevin Bennett's empty wallet was found alongside a Bob Dylan cassette.
Kevin Bennett actually survived the attack. He was in a very, very bad way, but he was standing, and it was actually Iceland staff who helped him to hospital.
The injuries inflicted on him were vicious and unprovoked. But the revelation that such an act of violence had been committed by teenagers would horrify investigators and the public alike.
He had a fractured eye socket, he had broken rib cage, he had a collapsed lung, really, really horrific internal injuries, and he would have suffered greatly.
Police immediately began an investigation into what they thought was a serious assault, perhaps by a man or a group of men. What they discovered about the people who attacked Kevin Bennett was to reveal the dysfunctional nature of the background of the perpetrators and the endless spiral of deprivation and crime they had inhabited since birth.
They didn't just commit the act, they thought about it, they prepared for it, and sadly they executed it.
On the morning of the 17th of August 2012, the badly injured body of Kevin Bennett was discovered behind the Iceland store on County Road in Walton, Liverpool. He'd been badly beaten and kicked around the body and head. The attack had been sustained and vicious. He'd suffered a fractured eye socket, a collapsed lung, and a broken rib cage. But Kevin Bennett tragically was not to survive this merciless assault. He died in hospital 6 days later.
He was a well-known character in Walton. He was an alcoholic, and occasionally he slept rough in Walton. He was well known in the community. He had family, he had a son, he had a mum, he had brothers. Unfortunately, circumstances dictated that he spent a lot of his time sleeping rough, and he would usually bed down outside the Iceland supermarket in Walton.
The police investigation began hours after the badly injured man was discovered. Now their serious assault case had become a murder hunt. Inquiries initially concentrated on violent figures in the neighbourhood, men with criminal records or known troublemakers who they believed would be capable of such an appalling and sustained attack. The local search failed to yield results, but the break in the case was to come almost immediately.
Within any group of killers, in any serial or murder situation where there's numbers, there is usually a weak link. And in this case, Simon Evans is the one who went to his mother and basically told her what happened. And she brought him straight to the police station. And he told police, he said, I kicked him, I booted him, and now he's dead. And he obviously then began to bring in the Doran Brothers into it, as they were, three of them were captured together on CCTV. And ultimately that would have played a major role in the boys being caught.
The police were now able to refer to CCTV footage taken close to the scene. It showed 3 boys on camera late at night. The very fact that 3 minors were out this late made them stand out immediately. The police now knew who they were looking for.
After reviewing the CCTV footage, police went round to the Doran brothers' mother, Linda, but it took a while for her to actually answer the door because they were banging, and she was so used to people banging on the door that she just simply ignored it.
Because she assumed it was the neighbours complaining about her boys as usual. But obviously the Doran brothers became pretty good suspects pretty quickly. It was almost an open secret within people in Walton that they were more than likely the people responsible for this due to what they had done in the past.
The boys' reputation in the neighbourhood was so bad that as soon as anything went wrong, people knew whose door to knock on looking for answers. Despite this, the names of the boys were not disclosed publicly until after their trial. Linda Doran, however, was going even further in an attempt to protect her sons when police did manage to make contact.
Eventually, they did speak to her, and she gave the boys a false alibi.
Linda lied to police about the whereabouts of her sons on that night. She said Connor was inside, unwell, upstairs, knowing full well he was out.
But CCTV told a different story. After further investigations and Simon Evans' statement, police arrested the 3. Their trial was set for January 2013.
The 3 boys all pled not guilty at the time of the trial, but it took just 4 weeks for a jury to find them guilty. They were found guilty of murder in February 2013, and in April they were sentenced. The eldest boy, Connor, was sentenced to 12 years, Simon Evans, 8 years, and the youngest, Brandon, was sentenced to 6 years for acting as a lookout.
After the boys were found guilty and sentenced, the judge said, and I quote, "I think it is a desperately sad reflection on this society that each of you was party to serious violence purely for the sake of it." I mean, that sums up exactly what this was about, what this trial was about. This was about proving that these 3 boys had no regard whatsoever for this man and were committing an act of violence simply because they were bored.
There appeared to be no doubt about who had been instrumental in instigating the attack on Kevin Bennett, that Simon Evans to a large extent had been led along.
What came out during the case was actually that Simon was doing it for a bet from the older Doran brother, Connor. and Connor said to him, I bet you can't kill that man. Simon then followed Connor as they approached him and they started kicking him. Now, the interesting thing here is that whilst both Doran brothers remained emotionless when the verdicts were read out, Simon Evans, in actual fact, became quite emotional. So it really does show the difference between the three boys.
Connor and Brandon showed no emotion during their trial, while as Simon was crying and showed a lot of emotion. Now, we can't take one incident of showing emotion or not showing emotion as how that person is. So we would need to see a lot more examples of how they display emotion to be able to judge what kind of person they are. But you could say the sign of showing no emotion is a sign that they're not feeling. They're not feeling remorse, they're not feeling empathy, which could indicate that maybe they are psychopaths, whereas Simon crying could indicate that he's showing remorse, he feels sorry, he knows his behaviour is bad, he feels bad for the individual, he can put himself in the shoes of another person.
The other way that it's reflected in terms of the gang-like mentality, in terms of the roles involved, is by the sentencing. Connor Doran was sentenced to 12 years, Simon Evans was sentenced to 8 years, and Brandon Doran, the lookout, was sentenced to 6 years. So it's almost like a pyramid scheme. In any gang or any group type culture, there's always roles, whether it be a leader or a follower.
There's no question that Connor's goading of Simon will have been successful, insofar as he may not have continued with the act but for the goading. However, I think it would be foolish of us to say that Simon isn't capable of similar acts to Connor. There would be other boys of that age who wouldn't necessarily be goaded in the same way. But within a community like that, a criminal community, and when they're on a rampage, as it were, a febrile atmosphere develops, where one act is never good enough and another act has to go further and further, and they will both have been part of this cycle into violence.
So, Connor Doran was seen as the instigator, but his problems may have been just as inherent as they were a product of his upbringing.
Connor Doran had the mental age of a 10-year-old. He was also said to have suffered from ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And it was said that he displayed much threatening behaviour throughout his young life, including when an ex-girlfriend was fired from the local B&M stores by her boss for an allegation of stealing. Connor threatened him. So the reality is he had a very unsettled mind at a young age. And the interesting thing about it is when they carried out the attack, they would have been in a gang-like mentality, almost like a wolf pack type mentality. In any gang, in any wolf pack, there is always a leader and there is followers. And in this case, it's reflected in two things. First of all, in their ages. Connor Doran, it was said during the trial, was seen as the leader. Of course, he was 17 years of age. His younger brother Brandon was 14 years of age. And Simon Evans, the other youth, was also 14 years of age. So Connor, age-wise, he's the leader of this group. He's the one that's leading the attack, instigating the attack. And he's the one that actually said to Simon Evans, do you have it in you to do him in? Almost goading him, almost challenging him. So he was the leader, and Simon Evans and his brother Brandon were the followers. Brandon got up on a scaffold as a lookout, while Simon and Connor carried out the attack.
But in this case, it seems like these children were on a state of alert all the time. So they were living defensively. Their minds were that everybody was against them. You'd say something to them, whatever it was that you were going to say to them, and their immediate response was going to be attack. It wasn't going to be friendly or accepting.
During the trial, another of Linda Doran's children fell foul of the court.
Jordan was charged with contempt of court for taking photographs and footage on his mobile phone. So it really was almost like a family affair, the trial. It was a bit of a show trial. And, it's just very sad what happened to Kevin. And the trial and the judge's comments sum it up perfectly as far as I'm concerned.
But despite the severity of the charges against her sons and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, the judge reserved his most damning criticism for Linda Doran.
Linda had a complete disregard for the whereabouts of her sons, especially that night. She told police that they were at home playing on computer games, knowing full well they were out and about. Doing what? She didn't know. She didn't particularly care. It was better than having them at home screaming and shouting and causing chaos behind the front door.
Linda's lack of parental responsibilities were now laid bare for all to see. In 2009, her son Jordan had been charged with manslaughter, but the case never made it to court. By 2012, the year Connor and Brandon were involved in the killing of Kevin Bennett, her eldest son, Ryan, was found guilty of killing a man with a bottle in a chip shop, later receiving a sentence where he will serve a minimum of 14 years. While Brandon and Connor's trial was ongoing, Linda's second son, Jordan, received a 6-month sentence for contempt of court, followed by Connor and Brandon's combined sentence of 26 years. Linda herself received 30 months for her role in perverting the course of justice.
Often with people where they go on to commit a murder, there's an argument, is it nature, is it nurture, mad or bad, we just don't know. But when a woman has 4 children where they all end up in prison, I think it's quite clear to say this is learned behaviour.
Linda had been exposed as an inconsistent parent. But were the now incarcerated children she'd attempted to bring up inherently evil, or was their violent behaviour the result of their upbringing and surroundings?
These 3 boys had no regard whatsoever for this man and were committing an act of violence simply because they were bored, as horrific as that sounds.
Through the trial, Kevin Bennett's mum didn't attend. She couldn't face it. After the verdicts were delivered and the sentences imposed, his cousin spoke outside court to say that the family had felt there'd been justice, that they got some closure. But I think they've always still struggled to accept that, why it happened. Kevin Bennett was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was incredibly unlucky. I don't think they'll ever be able to find true closure.
53-year-old Kevin Bennett, a vulnerable, homeless man, was kicked and punched senseless, later dying from his injuries as he slept rough in Walton, Liverpool in August the 17th, 2012. The perpetrators were 3 teenage boys, Simon Evans, aged 14, and 2 brothers, Connor and Brandon Doran, aged 17 and 14. The Dorans came from a deprived and fundamentally unsupervised family. They were the product of a broken and dysfunctional background. They barely knew their father, and their elder brothers had been involved in criminality from a young age.
Both Connor and Brandon perhaps didn't know the difference between right and wrong. They were surrounded in an environment where crime was in their family, and perhaps that did have an impact as to why exactly they carried out this horrific attack on Kevin.
For the community in Walton, the events surrounding the death of Kevin Bennett were shocking, but hardly surprising.
The community in Walton was shocked. There's no doubt about it. These kind of tragic events are so rare, but when they do happen, there was a real sense of shock in the community. I think for Liverpool, it evoked memories years earlier of the death of James Bulger, who was taken away by 2 young teenagers, the same age as these 3 kids, taken away and killed not far away, less than 5 miles away. So I think it evoked memories of that, and there's a real resilience in Liverpool, and people are fed up of these lawless kids on the streets. There's a lot of campaigning done by the police, by the press in Liverpool, to try and change perceptions and actually change the kind of mentality of kids being on the streets.
The Dorans began their lives as outcasts from the parts of society that behaves in a manner acceptable to the rest of the population. Their vulnerability and the lack of parenting and supervision in their lives meant that they were easily led and were too weak to reject the temptation of crime and antisocial behaviour.
What's interesting with the Doran Brothers, in comparison to other cases, is the fact that they worked in a group. And here we can refer to a concept known as diffusion of responsibility, which effectively means that as individuals, they might not necessarily engage in such criminal behaviour, but as a group, no one feels individually responsible. Outside of the fact that they committed the crime in a group is the fact that they were intoxicated, they had smoked cannabis, they were drunk off cheap cider, and this might have also been a contributing factor into not fully comprehending and understanding the gravity of the crime they were committing.
Conor taunted Simon, "You're not brave enough to do him in." I believe that Conor felt that to bully means that he doesn't get bullied. He probably learned from a young age that if he's the bully, he can protect himself. No one's going to challenge that. He's too intimidating for other people. He scares people into leaving him alone. So he taunted Simon and said those words. Simon is very young. He has very low self-esteem, very sensitive to criticism. Straight away, he has to prove Conor wrong and show him that he's manly enough to take out the actions and cause harm to this individual. I believe that Simon was too young to be able to make a good judgment in that situation. He was impulsive because he went straight to anger, and I believe that was due to very low self-esteem in Simon.
What you've got there is an accumulation of different factors. One is an habitual factor. They grew up, or they have grown up in a family where violence is normal. So that isn't something that comes different to them. It's not something that's strange. It's something they're used to. But you've also got a factor here of an ongoing anger against authority. Because of the failure or their perceived failure of the police to investigate the mother's brother's death. So you've then got something inside which is painful and hurtful and can't be managed, turned outwards, an attack against somebody else that they see as vulnerable. So their own vulnerability is seen unconsciously in the vulnerability of the man that they kill. So they're actually killing part of themselves by killing the man, but that is too deep analytically for most people to understand, and they certainly wouldn't understand it themselves. But with a deeper piece of psychoanalytic work, they might get to a level of understanding of it. But what you can't take away is the fact that they're still going to get all the influences of their family. And so just working against that, they have to have that status within the family of being the same as the family. So any intervention that's trying to work against that is going to be on an uphill struggle. So it's a complex psychological situation. But what you've also got is the fact that they're together, so they're egging each other on. So their primary attachment figures are almost certainly each other, rather than any secure adult attachment figures. And of course the other boy being brought in, again, it's an issue of status, of who am I? Am I strong enough to stand up to these boys who are going to, perhaps do it to me if I don't join in with it? So you get a whole range of things coming into play in a situation like that.
Social disorganisation argues that when an individual is in a group of peers that exhibit behaviour that isn't legal, but in that group is normalised, that in turn creates that individual to also internalise those behaviours and not see what they're doing as necessarily wrong.
If people have been dealt a really bad hand of cards in terms of their parenting, being given parenting where there is no empathy, it's very hard for them to go on to feel empathic for other people.
In regards to what the Doran brothers are, their upbringing, which was very dysfunctional and very neglectful, it is not completely uncommon in working class areas across the United Kingdom or even the world for young boys to experience backgrounds like they did. But in regards to, are they psychopaths? I don't think they're psychopaths, but certainly what they are was they were purely bad. They were just evil, out of control teenagers who decided to get cheap thrills in the most horrific way.
But what they did was in no way normal or even explicable for boys their age.
Very often it's said about criminals of this nature is that they know the words, but they don't know the music. In other words, they can say they're remorseful. They may even for a small period mean it, but ultimately they wouldn't. It may be that one of these three boys may have some remorse in them, maybe two. But the question is, will it have any length? Will it be there in 20 or 30 years' time? And I think the answer has to be no.
So the term violence for violence sake may be applicable here. I think here it's violence for praise. So there's actually a reward system taking place. Gangs are being formed in this impoverished background that these boys come from, and they're getting a lot of validation for being manly and showing signs of extreme violence, but it's survival of the fittest in these groups. From a young age, they know that if they don't commit these acts of violence, they're going to get teased, they're going to get bullied. Very similar to a prison environment. If you don't show that you're angry and aggressive and that you can beat another person up and cause harm and you're going to show someone who's boss, then you're going to be a victim. So this is survival. This is quite animalistic survival in this group. I don't believe that these boys were bad. I believe that they're surviving. If they show that they're violent, they're not going to become victims. And also, they've got fragile sense of self-esteem. They haven't been praised by parents. They haven't been nourished by parents. They haven't been shown lots of empathy from parents. So when they're teased, it really affects them. That causes them pain. They're very sensitive to criticism. So the words, "I bet you don't have it in you to do him in," is going to affect Simon. And then Simon is going to have to prove that he is good enough, and therefore goes on to be very violent.
And as for rehabilitation, is it possible that on completion of their sentences, the Doran brothers and Simon Evans can emerge to play a full role as adults in 21st century society?
Rehabilitated to what? The time to mend their roof was when the sun was shining when they were born. Nothing happened. The combination of a genetic disorder or disorders alongside family and societal influences within their subculture mean they're almost certainly will be unamenable to treatment or rehabilitation of any sort. The problem is with savage criminals like the Dorans is the only thing we can do is manage them, not cure them.
I think in this case, considering the boys' background, it's almost very difficult to say if they're going to be fully rehabilitated. These boys were desensitized to things from a very, very young age. In fact, one of them, when they were 3 years of age, was seen on a bus on his own with no adult or no guardianship with them. So they came from a very deprived background. They would have witnessed a lot of awful things. There was no control, there was no discipline. And when that's ingrained in the human psyche from a very young age, it's incredibly difficult to bring someone away from that. So as far as I'm concerned, is it impossible that they be rehabilitated? No, but it's going to be incredibly difficult.
Hopefully an attempt will be made to rehabilitate them. Whether it, how good that is will depend on where they are and whether they can stay somewhere long enough. I mean, there is a risk that they'll get moved around from prison to prison or facility to facility because of the difficulty of dealing with the issues. They will have other prisoners and prison officers who will be angry with them because of what they've done. There'll be, anger rolling around in whatever situation they find themselves in. They are separated now, so they have more chance perhaps of being given an opportunity to develop a sense of self as an independent person, not part of a duo, if you like. But if they're, because of the family that they've grown up in and the survival skills that they learned, they are likely to use those same survival skills in prison and behave well, so as not to draw attention to themselves, and potentially avoid any intervention on the basis, they seem to be doing all right, because the false self will become established and will enable them to live day to day and just wait for the time to get out.
There are people who have remarkable stories in terms of committing horrendous crimes and being able to achieve tremendous change. These cases are few and far between because often individuals who commit horrendous crimes have horrendous trauma and horrendous backgrounds, and they're too damaged to be able to change. But people are able to achieve change. So I don't believe in people being written off. I think each individual needs to be carefully assessed, and good decisions need to be made in terms of whether to offer them treatment or whether to lock them up in life for the public safety.
But in Walton in Liverpool, the place where the killers came from, the place where inevitably they'll return to, there is a sense of hope, despite the scars which this tragic case has left on the public consciousness. The case of what happened to Kevin Bennett that night in August 2012 is tragic beyond comprehension. By doing what they did, they ruined their own fragile lives, but they also cast a long shadow over the lives of the family of Kevin Bennett. But what about Linda Doran and her responsibility as a parent? In Liverpool, a city which has endured many tragic events which have forced the community to re-examine its values, there is a sense that abandoning people like Linda Doran and her family will lead to further disintegration of the social fabric.
I think if we give up on young people, that says more about us as a society and a generation than it does about the young person. There will inevitably be situations where, despite every intervention available, people may choose not to engage for whatever reason. I think those circumstances are very rare. I think there are few young people that really want to change or that would be very willing to change.
Well, nobody's born that way. Nobody is born as a psychopath or a sociopath. So they are all victims of the environment in which they've grown up. And so that's partly to do with whether their families got the support that they needed in order to give them the support that they needed when they were little, and whether they were picked up in school as being children who were in need of support, or if they were always treated as children who were just so difficult that nobody could give them the time that they needed. They were always in punishment and in sanctions. And as soon as you put that into place, you get a reaction to the sanctions, and then the behaviour gets worse, and they get moved to another school, and so it goes on. So yes, it's a failure of the system and a failure of society to recognise how important those first few years of life are. I mean, we've had over the last few years, we had Sure Start, and we've had various things that are meant to be making a difference, but most of those things that have been put in place have started for children aged 3 upwards, and most of the damage, the severe damage to the building blocks of the personality happened before the age of 3. And there's very little, if any, services that are geared towards recognising those needs. There's such a concentration on the physical needs, keeping children alive, which is obviously, if you can't keep them alive, you can't do anything else with them. But if you look at health visiting and primary social work with young children, the dominance of the interventions is around making sure that they're alive and well. And it's only, there is a change, it is coming, but it's very, very slow. This recognition of the need for the emotional development to be good enough as well as the physical care.
Kevin Bennett's story constantly reminds us that there are tragic consequences to social deprivation. But if there is any lesson to be learned, it is that constant vigilance needs to take the place of urban abandonment. Society has a continuing role to ensure that children receive the guidance necessary and that they have a respect for the world in which they grow up, rather than a learned disregard for authority and law and order.